Let's move on and talk about Wigan and Liam Richardson. You used the word stable footing there, Mike, in your last few sentences, and that is exactly what Wigan now find themselves on. They are, they're on a superb run at the moment. It culminated in a 4-0 victory over Bolton. It's a local derby. Bragging rights, of course, go the way of Wigan and Liam Richardson. But I think what we need to talk about here before we look in more depth at Richardson himself is the team talk that Ian Evatt did, which we suspect inspired Wigan to this victory. However, he's been, Liam Richardson's been very quick to play it down and said, he didn't do my team talk for me. We just carried on playing the way we always have been and stuck to our task and stuck to our plan. But there's no doubt, is there, that, he can play it down only once, but there's no doubt that Evatt's words were ringing in those players' ears.
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a faux pas from Evatt. I backed him, when he said it during the week. I kind of knew where he was coming from. He basically turned around and said, on performances so far, I think we're the best team in the division. I think he had every right to say that, but saying it in the build-up to a derby, a local derby, when the team you're coming up against, the bookies fancy them a lot more than they fancy you. I think it was premeditated on Evatt's part. I think he was trying to throw the gauntlet down to his own players as if to say, we're not League Two anymore. We've got to start taking ourselves seriously now. But everybody in Wigan seems to have latched onto it. The moment the words left his lips, it was local media, supporters on social media. It was just this big noise started being generated, about Bolton calling themselves the best team in the league. Once that noise is generated, it's impossible for that not to feed through to the players that, the opposition managers basically saying, that they're the best team in the league. And Liam Richardson afterwards, did mention a few times he was quick to distance himself from that having been used as a source of motivation. I'm sure he didn't necessarily make a big deal about it before the game, but he was also keen to say on numerous occasions afterwards, we respect the league, as if to say, you can't underestimate anybody. So don't start talking yourselves up because there's 7 or 8 teams that could win this league. And it's really important for us that we understand that we can only do what we can do. We can't control what others might do and how good they might be at some stage. So as long as we stay in the moment, we concentrate on ourselves, we keep doing our own jobs to the best of our ability, then see where it takes us. We'll respect the league. We'll respect every opposition. We're not going to come out and start saying we're the best at this, we're the best at that. So I think that was generally the take on it afterwards. And yeah, it's a bit of a clanger from Evatt in the end. But I think it's part of Evatt's nature to be this bullish. And I think he will still potentially use that humbling experience of yesterday to his advantage as well.
A really interesting interview, actually, on the Totally Football League Show podcast. And I know we shouldn't spend our time advertising other podcasts, Mike. But if you do get the chance to listen to it, it's I think it's about sort of 6, 7 or 8 minutes of Liam Richardson talking about the season so far. And there's a couple of quotes, actually. I'll come to another one in a second, but this relates to what you were saying a second ago. He said that he wants his side to be the best version of themselves as opposed to the best side in League One. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, it's the first I've heard of that, but it doesn't surprise me at all that he said that. I think that's very much his take on things. I think it's very much about the work you do on the training ground day to day. I think he's a workaholic. I think that he leaves no stone unturned in terms of his match preparation, and I think that's his biggest edge. And also, he's been behind the scenes doing this job for a number of years now. It's not always easy to step up from number 2 to number 1. And do the things that a manager has to do. But I think there's so much respect for what Richardson does on a day-to-day basis and the way he's able to set up a team. And what strikes me most about his tactical nous is how often Wigan score the first goal. And I even refer to last season when they were scraping around for players and, they were in a difficult place last season, under-resourced and stuff like that. And yet they were still going away to some of the top teams in the division and scoring the first goal, even if they weren't quite holding out or they were being, turned over late on and ended up losing games 2-1. They were going away from home to some of the toughest places. They were very well drilled out of possession and in terms of whether it was spoiling the game, whether it was, gamesmanship or to just wasting time or but also finding a route to goal with what little resources you had against this bigger hitter. And yet here's where they're weak. Here's where we can expose them. Here's the patterns of play we'll work on this week to unhinge this opposition. And it worked time and time again. The first goal record in some of those big games was remarkable. And we're seeing it again this season. Even when Wigan aren't on top in games or aren't necessarily playing well, they're not conceding. And then when they are on top in games, they're making it count and they're scoring goals. And I think it's full credit to what's going on the training ground at both ends of the pitch, the impact that's being had.
And we've got to talk about the shift that has happened over the course of the summer. So last season, against all expectations, Richardson kept Wigan afloat. And he did it on a shoestring. He barely had any backroom staff. He was pretty much doing everything himself. We talked about it briefly, actually, on the podcast. We didn't cover Richardson himself, but we did mention it at the end of the podcast that he was, we gave him kudos for doing everything at the club and still managing to keep the results rolling in. He also had a very, very small squad. And as we know in League One and indeed League Two, the fixture list can be very congested and injuries start to mount up and you need a big squad. Wigan didn't have that, but they still got result after result after result. Now they've got a bigger squad. The expectations are that they should be firing their way towards the top of the table. They were at the start of the season anyway. And he's got backroom staff. He's got people who are able to work with him. And it's a completely different ballgame. But Richardson's stance hasn't changed. The results haven't changed. And he still is doing a magnificent job. And it's almost as if there's been a complete 360 at this club. So surely this plays into the way he can adapt and his versatility and showing that he can do both sides.
Well, it's a completely different set of circumstances, as you say. And I thought that was a cause for concern going into the season. I didn't think it automatically translated that dragging a team out of a relegation battle, doing the rescue act in a crisis scenario, it's a completely different set of circumstances. Yeah, I mean, I'll use that phrase back about himself, being the best version of yourself. I think that's what Richardson is. And I think he has adapted to some degree, but I just think he's going in and being the best version of himself as a football manager day to day. And it's generating belief among players. So even if it's different sets of players this season, I think everybody goes into work and knows when somebody really knows what they're doing, who's your boss, and is going to hold you accountable. And, brings out the best in you as well. I think we all know that in any workplace that, if you walk into somewhere and there's a leader of that caliber. So I don't think it's necessarily about Richardson having changed anything necessarily he does from last season, because I'm seeing a lot of similarities of the Wigan team this season with the Wigan team last season. They've just got better players now. They've got more experienced players and they've pretty much got two players for every position, or, they've got a good depth of squad that they can rotate, or if anyone gets injured, someone can step in. And it's a really good balance to them. So I think it is where I thought this change of circumstances might make the job more difficult or make it somehow different. It seems to be playing out as if he's still doing the same job, but with better resources, but with the ability to cope with more random variables that might come his way. And because I don't think he thinks too far ahead into the future, so he doesn't get too carried away with plans and this is the way things have got to be. I think it's a flow state, and it's natural for him that if somebody throws him a curveball, he'll just roll with the punches. Whatever comes his way, he's quickly ready to adapt. So I think that's naturally in his skill set to adapt. But I don't think he's radically doing anything different this season from what he was doing last season. It's just the quality of the personnel, the depth of the personnel, and the resources behind the scenes and everything like that is just, he's able to do his job so much better now. And, the results are just translating just at a different level.
And the recruitment is interesting as well. They spent a lot of money in terms of wages this summer and completely revamped their squad. But let's face it, if there was any side in that division who needed bodies through the door, it was them. He talks about recruitment and he says that getting players in who know the league is important. Those who know that the challenges and the tricky conundrums that it brings up. I'm paraphrasing here, but this is what he says. He also talks about recruiting players who are good characters and have the right mentality to be there every single day, and says good people are important. He then follows by saying talent will get you to the door, but the right attitude will get you inside. So, this is a recruitment process which, on the face of it at the start of the summer, felt a bit scattergun. But clearly, there was an awful lot of thought behind it. And clearly, preparations for this window, the summer window, started very early. And Richardson himself was clearly heavily involved.
Yeah, and I mean, when those signings were being made, as a Wigan fan, I know on the masterclass, who was, a little bit underwhelmed as well. And, you're looking at the names and you're thinking, the kind of the word that leaps off the page on Wikipedia is journeyman, and you think, they've been around the block a lot. But no, he clearly values experience. And there's something about this recruitment strategy as well that I think is probably underplayed a little bit and a little underappreciated. You think of the two signings from Sunderland and the two signings from Portsmouth. Those players have all had disappointing campaigns with those two clubs in recent years, but they've been the course and distance of a League One campaign. They know what the pressure's like at the end of the season. They know exactly what's going to be, what they're going to be coming up against. There's going to be no real hidden surprises there, but they have been good enough to be playing at that level in the past few seasons. But also, what I think is undervalued is, at some stage, Wigan might be coming up against Sunderland and against Portsmouth in big 6-pointers towards the end of the season, and there's real value in having those players behind the scenes who knows how those managers operate, who knows what the strengths and weaknesses of particular players in certain areas of the field. When you're talking about match preparation on the training ground, which Richardson loves, and getting his hands dirty and really diving deep on things, these players have got invaluable information to pass on to you about those teams, and you don't need to worry about motivation. All those 4 players are going to want to finish above their former clubs this season as a starting point. It's they don't want to have made that move and then be told that, well, you made a mistake and your career went backwards. This is easy motivation for those players. So I think it's a bit of a masterstroke on both sides, and I think it shows that Richardson he's one of these managers that's got both sides. He's got the tactical logic and he's got the emotion. I think he understands with those players, apart from valuing the experience in the first place, I think he knows that tactically they can do whatever jobs he asks of them, and he's got in mind the different ways and styles he might want to play, but also knows he doesn't necessarily need to go overboard motivating them. They are self-motivating to begin with, but the fact that they're up in a promotion race this season against former clubs only adds a bit of spice to how motivated they're going to be week in, week out.
And in terms of Richardson himself, then you talk about how heavily involved he is with the preparation on the training ground. He talked about how he enjoys the analytical side as well. So he's embracing all the new technology that's coming in. But, also just seems like a really good, positive influence as well. We see Paul Cook without Liam Richardson, and although it's still early days and results are mixed, there always was that feeling that Richardson did a lot of the dirty work, a lot of the day-to-day stuff. And we're sort of seeing this play out now, aren't we? And of course, the pair meets in December as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be fascinating to see how Cook gets on this season from that perspective. Because, I do think Cook is beginning to get it right at Ipswich. I think Ipswich fans have just got to be patient with him, because I think he is going to get there. But he's having to do with the whole new backroom staff compared to what he had at Wigan. And we're now beginning to see, okay, you need to understand that Paul Cook was responsible for the culture of what got Wigan promoted last time. Liam Richardson now benefits from seeing how Cook operated firsthand. So that's going to help Richardson. This is not all necessarily just about what Richardson gave Cook. I'm sure Cook will have given Richardson bundles of experience of how to navigate a run-in, how to deal with pressure, certainly the emotional side of the game, and developing that team culture. But for Cook, it's going to be a slower process without Richardson. It's got to be. You've seen what Richardson does as a tactician, as an organizer of players on the training ground, and you're thinking, he's not going to be easy to replace. Liam Richardson's been on the circuit now for over a decade, I think, doing as a number 2. And he's seen his opportunity now. The time is right for me to stand up now and be a number 1 and stand on my own 2 feet and go it alone, because I believe I'm ready. And this is his big opportunity. For Paul Cook to replace someone like that, who's been his assistant for so many years, is going to be really difficult to strike upon. It's going to take time at least. I don't think you just pluck out another Liam Richardson from somewhere and start hitting the ground running again. So it's going to be fascinating what happens at Ipswich. But I think also Liam Richardson will also be probably one of the first to, be grateful for everything that he learned under Paul Cook as well. And even though it's shaping up as though Richardson's going to finish up above Cook this season, That's not to that. I don't think Cook should necessarily be judged side by side against his from former protege in that way.
Yeah, he speaks very highly of Cook and talks about his absolute love of football and how he operates on a day-to-day basis. So there's a huge amount of respect. You know, sometimes when managers like that go up against one another, we can see fireworks on the touchline, but I suspect when they meet, there's going to be, you know, a huge amount of respect between the pair. With that in mind, everything that he's learned from Paul Cook along the way, and of course he's learned from his own experiences as well, he'll be taking every little thing on board, no doubt. If Wigan find themselves, and I personally might think that Wigan are good enough for automatics, but if Wigan find themselves in the playoffs, or they, you know, are top and they're the ones that are being sort of shot at in March and April by the sides below them, do we think Richardson has enough about him to navigate his way through what could be a tricky period? Because so far we're still early doors in the season. You know, this is just about getting as many points on board, making a fast start. He's done that bit really well, but there's plenty of crunch moments to come, aren't there, during the course of the campaign?
Yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I think he's going to be fine. I think he's going to be fine because for two main reasons. He stays in the moment and he doesn't get lost in his head. And I think every step of the way, he won't allow circumstances to affect him. He'll just keep focusing on what he can control on a day-to-day basis. He won't even think 2 games ahead. Never mind, we've got, you know, some managers like to do a block of 6 games and things like that, and points targets from month to month or whatever it might be. I think Richardson's just literally 1 game at a time. We're all in on this next game. Once that game's past us, then we're all in on the next game. And it's just like that every step of the way. And I think because that's a natural flow state for him, I do believe. And because that's so effortless for him to be that way, I think it rubs off on everybody around him. I don't think it's a case of, oh, well, he's just saying this, or, you know, he's trying to put on this persona. I think it's just the way he is. It's literally 1 game to the next, and don't get too far ahead of yourself. And I think in the main, I think managers of this type, I think of Chris Wilder as probably the best example. Once they get a good thing going and they don't allow anybody to get further ahead than just the next game and the next game and the next game, very rarely trip up or hit too many crisis points within a season that it becomes rudderless. So I think Wigan will be one of those teams this season that will just respond very well to the, you know, there's going to be bumps in the road, they're going to have defeats, but when they do, I think they'll always respond well to it. And I think that's the key ingredient for me. As far as I see it now, looking at League One, I know we've got the advantage now, so many games in. Other teams have started well, but for me, Wigan are the one team that everybody in the division should be looking at and thinking, if we finish above them, we're going to be promoted. There's always one team every year that you try to think, right, who's the steady team? 2 points per game. If you had to say one team now is definitely going to get 85 to 90 points, for me, it would be Wigan.